The magnetic restraints bit into my wrist with a cold, rhythmic pulse, reminding me that freedom was now a luxury I could no longer afford. The tribunal chamber of the Terran hegemony was a cathedral of brushed steel and unforgiving light, designed specifically to make a man feel like a microscopic dust mote under the boot of a titan. High above me, perched on a dais of obsidian-colored polymer, sat 5 officers whose faces were as immobile as the moon of Thanatos. HFY Caelum Vance, the lead prosecutor began, his voice amplified by the acoustic emitters hidden in the walls until it sounded like the growl of a hungry predator. You stand accused of high treason, the sabotage of hegemony property, and the unauthorized release of a Tier 1 enemy combatant. How do you plead? I looked down at the restraint band on my left arm. It was glowing a soft amber, indicating my heart rate was slightly elevated. I cleared my throat, the sound echoing hollowly in the vast space. The air in here smelled of ozone and expensive filtration, a far cry from the sour, recycled breath of the detention sector. Is the coffee in this building as bad as it was on the Shard? I asked. Because if it is, I plead guilty to everything just to avoid another cup. A ripple of uneasy silence washed over the room. Admiral Valerius, the man in the center chair, leaned forward. His eyes were like 2 shards of flint. This is not a comedy performance, Vance. You are looking at a permanent extraction of your neural consciousness. You will be a vegetable in a jar before the sun sets over the Capitol. Give me one reason why I shouldn't sign the order right now. I leaned back as much as the magnetic locks would allow. Because, Admiral, I replied, staring him straight in the eye, I've spent 12 years following orders that turned my soul into a graveyard. For once, I decided to do something that actually made sense, even if it cost me my head. The memories began to claw their way back then, unbidden and vivid. They dragged me back 3 weeks across the light years to that god-forsaken rock we called the Shard. The Shard was an asteroid-based observation post that had been rotting in the vacuum for over 40 years. It was a place where the hegemony sent equipment to break and soldiers to be forgotten. The walls were stained with a permanent layer of industrial grime, and the gravity generators had a habit of fluctuating, making you feel like you were walking through knee-deep mud one minute and floating like a dandelion the next. I had been assigned to the night shift in the high-security wing. It was a corridor of 10 cells, 9 of which were empty. The 10th cell held the reason for the tension that had gripped the station like a fever. The containment field hummed with a low-frequency vibration that rattled your teeth if you sat too close. Inside that blue-tinted cage sat X09. According to the data slate on my desk, she was a monster. The report claimed she had personally orchestrated the meltdown of the New Geneva colony, vaporizing over 5,000 civilians in a single afternoon. But as I sat there, sipping a cup of sludge that only technically qualified as coffee, I didn't see a monster. I saw a woman with skin the color of starlight and ears that tapered into elegant, leaf-like points, sitting perfectly still on a hard metal bench. She wore the standard-issue gray jumpsuit of a prisoner, yet she wore it like a silk gown. "You are staring again, Corporal," she said without turning her head. Her voice was melodic, possessing a strange resonance that seemed to bypass the ears and vibrate directly in the chest. I shifted in my chair, the metal creaking. "It's my job to stare. You're the most expensive thing on the station. Is that how you categorize living beings?" she asked, finally turning to look at me. Her eyes were deep pools of indigo, lacking pupils but overflowing with a terrifying intelligence. "By their cost to your government?" "In this sector, lady, everything has a price tag," I muttered, taking another cautious sip of the coffee. The liquid tasted like burnt copper and regret. Even the air we're breathing is being billed to the taxpayers. She stood up slowly, moving with a fluid grace that made the cramped cell seem like a palace. She walked to the very edge of the shimmering energy barrier, her hand hovering just millimeters away from the lethal blue glow. "Tell me, Caelum Vance," she said, reading the nameplate on my chest. "Why do humans insist on drinking that substance? It smells of scorched earth and biological failure." I laughed, a short, dry sound. "We call it coffee. It's the only thing that keeps us awake enough to realize how miserable we are." "A strange honesty," she murmured. "I find that refreshing. Most of your colleagues prefer to spend their shifts shouting insults or reciting the list of my supposed crimes. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the console. Well, according to this report, you're the butcher of New Geneva. Not exactly the kind of person I'd invite to a Sunday roast. Do you believe everything your machines tell you? She asked, her gaze intensifying. I believe in evidence, I said, though my voice lacked conviction. Evidence is a fickle thing, she replied. It can be manufactured as easily as your synthetic bread. But the hum of a station's engines? That cannot lie. This place is dying, Corporal. The metal is tired. The people are tired. And yet you stay. I'm a soldier. I go where the brass tells me to go. She tilted her head, studying me like I was a curious biological specimen. No, you are a man who is waiting for a reason to stop running. You just haven't realized it yet. I turned back to my monitors, my heart thumping against my ribs. I didn't like how she looked at me. It felt like she was peeling back the layers of my carefully constructed cynicism and looking at the raw, wounded parts beneath. Just sit down and shut up, X09, I growled. My name is Elowen, she said softly. I didn't answer. I just stared at the security feed, watching the empty corridors and the flickering lights, wondering why a mass murderer was worried about the quality of my beverage. Outside the observation port at the end of the hallway, the nebula of Thanatos swirled in shades of violet and bruised gold. It was beautiful and deadly, much like the woman in the cell behind me. That was the first night. By the fourth night, the world I thought I understood had begun to dissolve. 6 days into her detention, the routine of the Shard had been shattered by an arrival that made everyone from the kitchen staff to the station commander sweat through their uniforms. A Black Ops transport, sleek and windowless like a coffin, had docked at Umber Gate. Out stepped a group of men in pristine white uniforms, the Internal Security Bureau. They didn't look like soldiers. They looked like accountants who enjoyed pulling the wings off flies. They took over the observation lounge and started demanding every log, every video feed, and every scrap of data related to our prisoner. I was sitting in the mess hall, trying to ignore the tension, when my friend Jax sat down across from me. Jax was a technician who had spent too many years breathing recycled air. His skin had a permanent grayish tint, and his hands never quite stopped shaking. Caelum, we've got a problem, he whispered, leaning so close I could smell the ozone on his coveralls. I'm a guard on a rock in the middle of nowhere, Jax. My entire life is a problem. What's new? I was running a diagnostic on the data transfer from the New Geneva archives, he said, his voice barely audible over the hum of the ventilation. The files they sent over to justify the execution, they're hollow. Hollow? What do you mean? I mean they're shells. The encryption timestamps are backdated. The satellite footage of the explosion? It wasn't taken at New Geneva. I recognized the thermal signature. It's from a mining accident on Vesta 4 3 years ago. They just filtered it and changed the coordinates. I felt a cold sensation crawl up my spine. You're saying the evidence is faked? I'm saying someone spent a lot of credits to make sure she looks guilty, Jax said, glancing nervously toward the door. And those ISB guys? They aren't here to investigate. They're here to make sure the execution goes off without a hitch. The order comes down at 2100 hours tomorrow. I looked down at my tray of synth loaf. It suddenly looked even more unappetizing than usual. Why would the hegemony fake a war crime to execute a Xylari operative? Maybe because she's not just an operative, Jax muttered, standing up. Just be careful, Caelum. Don't go poking the bear. This goes all the way up to the high command. I spent the next 4 hours of my shift in a daze. When I finally reached the detention wing, Elowen was waiting for me. She wasn't sitting on the bench this time. She was standing by the barrier, her hands clasped behind her back, watching a small maintenance drone struggle to clean a smudge on the ceiling. It has a broken sensor, she said as I sat down. The little machine, it keeps trying to fix a ghost. It's just a drone, Elowen, I said, the name slipping out before I could stop it. Even a drone deserves to know the truth of its surroundings, she replied, her indigo eyes turning to mine. You look troubled, Corporal. Did the coffee finally win the war against your stomach? I didn't answer. I pulled up her file on my console. I stared at the images of the New Geneva ruins, the twisted metal, the bodies in the streets. I looked at the timestamps Jax had mentioned. Once you knew what to look for, the cracks were everywhere. The shadows in the photos didn't match the local sun's position. The forensic reports used terminology that hadn't been in circulation for a decade. It was a beautiful, elaborate lie. "Why are you really here?" I asked, my voice cracking slightly. She didn't move. "I am here because my people wanted peace, and yours wanted a reason to keep the factories running. War is a very profitable business for the hegemony, is it not?" I stood up and walked to the barrier. "If I report this, if I showed the discrepancies—" She let out a soft, sad laugh. "To whom would you report it? The men in the white uniforms? They are the ones who wrote the script. You are just a prop in their play, Caelum." I looked at her, really looked at her. Beneath the calm exterior, I saw a flicker of something human, or whatever the Xylari equivalent was. It was a profound, aching loneliness. "They're going to kill you tomorrow," I said. 2100 hours. "I know," she said quietly, "but the universe has a way of correcting its own imbalances. Courage is often the catalyst for that correction. Is that what you call it? Courage? I think it's just being too stubborn to die." "There is a fine line between the two," she admitted. "Tell me, Caelum, in all your years of service, have you ever done something that wasn't for the hegemony? Something that was just for you? Because it was the right thing to do?" I thought about that kid in the ruins of the border wars, the one I was supposed to neutralize because he was carrying a high-priority package that turned out to be a raggedy teddy bear. I had lowered my rifle then. My commander had called me a coward and sent me to the brig for 6 months. "Once," I whispered. She smiled then, a genuine, radiant smile that seemed to dim the harsh blue glow of the containment field. "Then you already know what you have to do." I looked at the control panel. It was a simple sequence: 4 digits, a biometric scan, and a manual override. It would trigger every alarm on the station. It would turn me into a hunted man. It would end my life as I knew it. I checked the time. 1900 hours. 2 hours until the executioners arrived. I looked back at Elowen. "You're a queen, aren't you?" I asked, a sudden realization hitting me. "The way you stand, the way you talk, you're not just some diplomat." She leaned her forehead against the cool air just outside the energy field. "In my world, we do not have queens in the way you understand them. I am a weaver. I hold the threads of my people's songs. If I die here, the song ends in blood." The station groaned, a deep metallic sound that felt like a dying breath. I made my choice in that moment, not because I loved her, and not because I hated the hegemony. I did it because I was tired of being a ghost in a machine that only knew how to grind things into dust. I reached for the console. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice hushed. "I'm making the most irresponsible decision of my career," I said, my fingers dancing over the keys. "And if you start a war once you get out of here, I'm going to be very annoyed." The containment field flickered. The hum died down to a low whistle, and then, with a soft electronic sigh, the blue barrier vanished. For the first time, there was nothing between us but the stale, recycled air of the shard. "Go," I said, pointing toward the secondary maintenance tunnel. "It leads to the trash compactors. There's an automated hauler leaving in 15 minutes. If you can hack the airlock, you're out." She stepped out of the cell, her movements silent as a shadow. She stopped in front of me, so close I could smell something like crushed jasmine and cold rain. She reached out and touched my cheek, her skin surprisingly warm. "The galaxy is a vast and dark place, Caelum Vance," she whispered. "But today you have lit a fire that will be seen from every corner of the void." Then she was gone, a silver flash in the dim hallway. I sat back in my chair, picked up my metal cup, and took a long, slow sip of the terrible coffee. I had exactly 32 seconds before the automated system realized the cell was empty. I spent those seconds wondering if the Xylari really did have better coffee. 32 seconds later, the sirens began to scream. The amber light on my restraint band didn't just indicate a rising heart rate anymore. It was flashing a sharp, insistent crimson. In the silence of the hegemony tribunal, that tiny pulsing light felt like a ticking bomb. Admiral Valerius sat motionless, his shadow stretching across the obsidian dais like a dark stain. He wasn't just an officer. He was a relic of the old guard, a man who believed that the stability of the human species was built on a foundation of unyielding obedience and very long, very quiet silences. "You released her, Vance," Valerius said, his voice dropping an octave until it resonated in the floorboards. "You bypassed 3 layers of military-grade encryption, neutralized a high-security containment field, and allowed a Xylari sovereign to vanish into the Thanatos Nebula. All because you didn't like the forensic timestamps?" I shifted my weight, the magnetic locks on my ankles humming in protest. "It wasn't just the timestamps, Admiral. It was the whole damn atmosphere. The shard was suffocating under the weight of a lie that everyone was too afraid to call out." The Admiral leaned back, his eyes narrowing. "Tell us about the interrogation, Corporal. Tell this tribunal what happened 30 minutes after the sirens began." I closed my eyes and the sterile white walls of the courtroom dissolved. I was back on the shard. The red emergency strobes were slashing through the darkness of the detention corridor like rhythmic wounds. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and the heavy metallic clatter of heavy infantry boots. I hadn't tried to run, not yet. I had sat in my chair at the security console, hands behind my head, watching the empty cell where Elowen had been sitting only moments before. I was waiting for the storm to break. It broke in the form of Agent Silas Kalis. He didn't walk into the room. He glided, flanked by 4 tactical responders in full vacuum-rated armor. Kalis was the kind of man who looked like he had been manufactured in a lab rather than born. His uniform was so white it hurt to look at, and his face was a mask of cold, professional curiosity. He didn't look angry. That was what made him terrifying. "HFY Vance," Kalis said, stopping 2 meters from my desk. His voice was like dry parchment rubbing together. "I hope you have a very compelling reason for why my prisoner is currently occupying a trash hauler headed for deep space." I looked at him, then at the smoking remains of the console's override port. "She didn't like the coffee, Agent. I figured I'd show her the exit." Kalis didn't blink. He gestured to one of the armored soldiers, who stepped forward and slammed a heavy magnetic pulsed rifle butt into my stomach. The air left my lungs in a violent rush, and I doubled over, my forehead hitting the cold metal of the deck. "That was for the sarcasm," Kalis said mildly. "Now let's try again. Why did you release the Butcher of New Geneva?" "She's not a butcher," I gasped, trying to pull oxygen back into my system. My ribs felt like they had been rewritten by a sledgehammer. "Check the data, Kalis. The Vesta 4 archives. The thermal signatures don't lie." The agent stepped over me, his polished boots clicking on the floor. "We are not here to debate the nuances of orbital photography, Corporal. We are here to manage a war. In war, truth is a resource, and right now the hegemony requires a specific kind of truth to keep the civilian populations from demanding a ceasefire." He knelt beside me, grabbing a handful of my hair and pulling my head back so I had to look into his empty gray eyes. "You think you're a hero? You're a glitch, Vance. A small, insignificant error in a very large and necessary machine, and I'm the man who fixes glitches." He stood up and nodded to his men. "Take him to Interrogation Suite 4, and find out if he was working with any other sleepers on this station." They dragged me down the hallway, my boots scraping against the deck plating. As we passed the maintenance closet where Elowen had disappeared, I noticed something small on the floor. It was a faint glowing filament, no thicker than a human hair, shimmering with a soft indigo light. It was a strand of the weave. The soldiers didn't see it. To them, it was just another bit of station debris. But as I was dragged past, the filament seemed to vibrate, a low-frequency hum that resonated in the fillings of my teeth. It was a message, a lingering echo of the woman who had sat in that cell and talked about the songs of her people. They threw me into Interrogation Suite 4, a room that was essentially a pressurized box designed for sensory deprivation. No windows, no clocks, just a single chair bolted to the floor and a light that was slightly too bright to be comfortable. Kalis spent the next 6 hours trying to break my mind. He didn't use physical violence after the initial blow. He was more refined than that. He used ultrasonic frequencies that made my brain feel like it was being scraped with a rusted spoon. He played recordings of the New Geneva explosion over and over, trying to force the guilt into my subconscious. "Admit you were compromised, Vance." His voice would drone over the speakers. Admit she used some kind of Xylari mind control on you. It's the only way you survive this. I sat there, staring at the white wall, my mind focused on that single indigo hair. I realized then that Kalis and the men who ran the hegemony weren't just evil in the classical sense. They were empty. They had traded their humanity for efficiency, their empathy for a seat at the high table of galactic power. They couldn't understand why a soldier would throw away his life for a prisoner, because to them, life was just a series of tactical assets to be spent. Around the 8th hour, something changed. The lights in the interrogation room flickered once, twice, and then turned a deep, resonant indigo. The ultrasonic humming stopped. In its place, I heard a sound that didn't belong on a military station. It was the sound of wind rushing through a forest, the chime of crystal bells, and a voice that was both 1,000 light years away and right inside my head. "The threads are still connected, Caelum," the voice whispered. I looked around the empty room. Elowen! The door to the suite hissed open. It wasn't Kalis. Standing in the doorway was a small, battered maintenance drone, its optical sensor glowing with that same indigo light. It beeped softly, a sound that oddly resembled a greeting. The drone drifted into the room and extended a small mechanical arm. Held in its claw was a silver device no larger than a coin, the same one Kestrel had used to call her ship in the original story. But this felt different. It was a thimble of the weave, a concentrated piece of Xylari technology that could bridge the gap between biological thought and digital systems. The little robot approached me, and for a second, I remembered Elowen asking if the drones had names. "Hello, Rusty," I whispered, naming the machine on the spot. "You here to bail me out?" The drone beeped again and pressed the silver thimble against my neck. The world exploded into a symphony of data. I wasn't just sitting in a chair anymore. I was the station. I could feel the cold vacuum of space pressing against the outer hull, the rhythmic throb of the fusion core in the lower decks, and the frantic electrical pulses of the ISB agents searching for their lost queen. I could see Kalis in the command center, his face twisting with a rare moment of genuine frustration as the station's computer systems began to ignore his commands. But more than that, I could feel Elowen. She wasn't on the station anymore, but she had left a part of herself behind, not as a weapon, but as a map. She had given me the keys to the kingdom, and for the first time in 32 years, I wasn't just a soldier following orders. I was the glitch that was going to break the machine. I stood up, the magnetic restraints on the chair falling away as if they had never been locked. My body felt light, energized by a frequency that the hegemony didn't even have a name for yet. "Let's go, Rusty," I said to the drone. "We've got a message to send, and I'm pretty sure the brass is going to hate the delivery." The corridors of the Shard were no longer just hallways to me. Through the connection of the weave, they were arteries, and I could feel the blood of the station, the data, the power, the oxygen flowing through them. Every sensor, every camera, every automated turret was a sense organ I could tap into. It was a terrifying amount of power for a man who had spent his life being told when to eat and when to sleep. Rusty, the little maintenance drone, led the way. He moved with a newfound purpose, his battered chassis hovering half a meter off the deck. We were moving toward the primary communications array, located 3 levels up in the station's spire. If I could reach it, I could broadcast the unredacted files from the Vesta 4 accident to every civilian frequency in the sector. The ISB wouldn't be able to bury the truth if every miner, freighter captain, and colony administrator was looking at the evidence on their personal tablets. We reached the heavy blast doors of Sector 7G, the industrial heart of the station. This was where the air got thicker, smelling of hot oil and grinding metal. "Halt!" a voice boomed from the end of the hallway. I didn't turn. I didn't have to. Through the station's security cameras, I could see 2 tactical responders rounding the corner, their rifles raised. They were wearing the heavy matte black armor of the ISB's personal guard. "Drop the drone and put your hands on your head, Vance," the lead soldier shouted. "We have authorization to use lethal force." I stopped and looked at Rusty. "You want to handle this, or should I?" The drone beeped a series of rapid, melodic tones. Suddenly, the lighting in the hallway shifted from white to a blinding, strobing ultraviolet. The soldiers cried out, their visors struggling to compensate for the sudden shift in the spectrum. At the same time, the gravity plates beneath their feet flickered. For a split second, they were weightless, and then, as Rusty sent another command through the weave, the gravity surged to 3 times the standard Earth pull. The soldiers were slammed into the deck with the force of a falling anvil, their heavy armor making a sickening crunch against the metal. They weren't KIA, killed in action, but they weren't getting up anytime soon. Their internal diagnostics would be screaming at them, and their limbs would feel like they were made of lead. I walked past them, feeling a strange pang of guilt. These men were just like I had been, tools. They were following orders, believing they were protecting the hegemony from a terrorist. "I'm sorry, boys," I muttered as I stepped over the fallen squad leader, "but you're on the wrong side of history today." We entered the elevator shaft, but instead of taking the lift, I used the weave to command the maintenance platform to descend. We climbed on, and I sent us hurtling upward at a speed that would have triggered every safety alarm on the station if I hadn't already silenced them. As we ascended, my mind drifted back to the tribunal. I could almost hear Admiral Valerius's voice in the present, questioning my motives. "You chose to betray your own kind for an alien," he had said, "a creature that doesn't even breathe the same air as you." It wasn't about the air, Admiral, I thought. It was about the fact that she was the only one in the room who didn't lie to me. We reached the communications spire, a narrow room filled with humming servers and glowing holographic arrays. The view from the wraparound windows was breathtaking. The Thanatos Nebula was a swirling sea of amethyst, and for a moment I could see the tiny silver speck of the hauler Elowen was on, drifting toward the jump point. She was almost safe. I moved to the main terminal, my fingers hovering over the keys. The weave thimble on my neck was burning now, a warm, rhythmic heat that felt like a heartbeat. I began to upload the data packets Jax had found, the fake timestamps, the manipulated satellite footage, the secret memos from the High Command discussing the necessity of the New Geneva incident to justify a budget increase for the naval fleet. It was all there. 100,000 credits spent on a lie that cost 5,000 lives. Upload progress. 60%, 70%. The door behind me hissed open. I didn't look up. I knew the footsteps. They were light, calculated, and devoid of any human warmth. "Agent Kalis." "Step away from the console, Corporal," Kalis said. He was holding a small, elegant disruptor pistol, the kind designed to scramble a man's nervous system without leaving a mark on his skin. I continued the upload. 80%. "You're making a mistake, Vance," Kalis continued, his voice calm. "You think the people want the truth? The people want to feel safe. They want an enemy they can hate so they don't have to look at the cracks in their own lives. If you release that data, you aren't a hero. You're the man who destroyed the peace of 1 million families." "A million families living on a foundation of corpses," I countered, finally turning to face him. "How many more colonies are you planning to vaporize, Kalis? How many more necessary tragedies do you have in your budget for the next fiscal year?" Kalis sighed, a sound of genuine disappointment. "You soldiers are so sentimental. You see a pretty face in a few poetic words from a Xylari princess, and you forget that the universe is a zero-sum game. If we don't dominate, we disappear." 90%. The drone Rusty suddenly zoomed toward Kalis, its little manipulator arms waving in a frantic attempt to distract him. Kalis didn't even flinch. He raised the disruptor and fired. A bolt of blue energy struck the drone, and Rusty let out a shrill, digital scream before tumbling to the floor, sparks showering from his shattered optical sensor. I felt a surge of cold, white-hot anger that had nothing to do with the weave and everything to do with being a human being. "You shouldn't have done that," I whispered. "I didn't use a gun. I didn't have to." I reached into the weave and found the power regulation system for the communication spire. I didn't shut it down. I redirected it. I took the massive energy surge required for an interstellar broadcast and channeled a fraction of it into the floor plating beneath Kalis's feet. The agent realized what was happening a microsecond too late. The metal deck erupted in a discharge of static electricity. It wasn't enough to kill him. I wasn't a butcher, but it was enough to seize every muscle in his body and send him into a violent convulsion. He hit the floor, his disruptor skittering across the room. 99%. 100%. Broadcast initiated. The data packets flooded out into the void, riding on a high-gain carrier wave that would bypass every military jammer in the sector. Within minutes, the truth was no longer a secret. It was a pandemic. I slumped against the console, the heat from the weave thimble finally fading. I looked down at Rusty. The little drone was silent, its indigo glow gone. I knelt beside it and touched the charred metal of its casing. "Thank you," I whispered. I looked out the window. The silver hauler was gone, having slipped into the jump point. Elowen was home, or as close to home as she could get. The station's internal security teams were already cutting through the door. I could hear the roar of the plasma torches and the shouting of men who were still following orders they no longer understood. I didn't fight them. I didn't try to escape. I just sat on the floor next to a broken robot and waited for the universe to catch up. Back in the tribunal chamber, the silence was absolute. The 5 officers on the dais were staring at me as if I were a ghost. The data I had broadcast 3 weeks ago had already caused riots on 7 human colonies. 3 generals had been forced into early retirement, and the high command was currently a nest of vipers eating their own. "You did all that," Admiral Valerius said, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and something that looked suspiciously like fear. "You crippled the hegemony's political structure for a single Xylari life." "No, Admiral," I said, standing as tall as my restraints would allow. "I did it for 5,000 dead civilians on New Geneva. I did it because I was tired of the static." Valerius stood up, his face flushed. "It doesn't matter. The broadcast might have changed the public's mind, but it doesn't change the law. You are a traitor to your species, Vance, and the penalty for treason is death." He reached for the electronic gavel to finalize the sentence, but he never touched it. A low, deep vibration began to shake the tribunal chamber. It wasn't the sound of engines or the groan of metal. It was a sound that felt like a chorus of voices singing in a language that predated the stars. The ceiling of the chamber, a massive dome of reinforced glass, began to glow with a brilliant, shimmering indigo light. The technician at the sensor console screamed, "Sir! Multiple warp signatures detected. They didn't use the jump gates. They're folding space right on top of us." "How many?" Valerius roared. The technician's voice was shaking. 1, 2, 20, 60. "My God, Admiral, it's the entire Xylari Royal Guard." I looked up through the glass dome. The black sky above the capital city was being blotted out by ships that looked like they were grown rather than built. Elegant, organic vessels that shimmered with the light of 1,000 nebulas. At the center of the formation was a flagship that spanned 5 kilometers, its hull draped in the glowing threads of the weave. The holographic transmitter in the center of the courtroom flickered to life. A figure appeared. She wasn't wearing a gray prisoner's jumpsuit anymore. She was clad in armor that looked like it had been forged from the heart of a star, and a crown of indigo crystal sat upon her brow. Her eyes, those deep pools of starlight, found mine instantly. "Hello, Caelum," Queen Elowen said, her voice echoing through the chamber like the tolling of a great bell. "I believe your trial has gone on quite long enough." The Admiral stood frozen, his hand still hovering over the gavel. This is an act of war." "No," Elowen replied, her gaze turning to him with a cold, regal authority. "This is a debt collection, and I have come to collect the man who saved the song." She looked back at me, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like a glitch. I didn't feel like a soldier or a traitor. I felt like someone who was finally home. The air in the tribunal chamber had gone from sterile to electric in the span of 10 seconds. The hum of the Xylari fleet hanging over the capital was a physical weight, a vibration that rattled the heavy obsidian dais and made the water in the judge's glasses ripple like miniature stormy seas. Admiral Valerius looked like a man who had been told the gravity of the planet had decided to take a holiday. His face shifted from a defiant crimson to a sickly, pale marble. "This is an invasion," Valerius whispered. Though with the acoustic amplifiers still active, his voice boomed through the hall like a dying thunderclap. "You have brought a war fleet into the heart of our sovereign space. Queen Elowen, this is a violation of every interstellar accord signed in the last 300 years. The holographic image of Elowen shimmered. She didn't look like the tired, jumpsuit-clad prisoner I had shared synthetic coffee with anymore. She looked like the manifestation of an ancient star. Her armor reflected the indigo light of the ships above, and the threads of the weave pulsed around her fingers like living veins of gold. "I have brought an escort, Admiral," she replied, her voice smooth and dangerous. "If it were an invasion, you would not be standing there debating the nuances of old treaties. You would be ash. I am here for a single transaction. Release the man you call a traitor, and I will consider our accounts settled for the day." Valerius gripped the edge of his desk so hard his knuckles turned white. "Corporal Vance is a citizen of the Terran hegemony. He is subject to our laws, our justice, and our execution orders. You cannot simply zip in here and demand we hand over a high-level deserter because he did you a favor. The brass back at command would have my head on a platter before the hour was out. Then perhaps you should find a more suitable platter," Elowen said, "because my ships are currently locking onto your orbital defense grid. I believe your tactical officers are currently informing you that your shields have been bypassed by our harmonic frequencies. You are naked in the dark, Admiral. Do not test the patience of a weaver who has just spent a week in your charming little shard." I sat in the restraint chair, watching the two of them bark at each other. It felt surreal. 1 hour ago, I was a dead man walking. Now, I was the centerpiece of a diplomatic standoff that could flatline half the sector. I looked at the guard standing to my left, a young kid named Miller. He couldn't have been more than 19. His rifle was shaking in his hands and his eyes were glued to the ceiling as if he expected a Xylari boarding pod to crash through the roof any second. "Hey, Miller," I whispered. The kid flinched, almost dropping his weapon. "Shut up, Vance. You're making it worse." "Relax, kid," I said, my voice low and steady. "If they wanted to blow this place, they would have done it 5 minutes ago. Just keep your finger off the trigger. You don't want to be the grunt who starts a galactic war because you had a nervous twitch." Miller swallowed hard, but he lowered the muzzle of the rifle a few centimeters. "Thanks," he muttered, "but you're still a sector rat in my book." "Fair enough," I said with a faint smirk. On the dais, the legal officers were frantically whispering to Valerius. They were looking at data tablets, their faces etched with the kind of terror that only comes when the math stops adding up in your favor. The Admiral finally closed his eyes, a long, ragged breath escaping his lungs. He looked defeated, not by morality, but by the sheer, overwhelming reality of 42 Xylari dreadnoughts parked over his chimney. "Fine," Valerius spat, looking at the hologram with pure venom. "We will grant a diplomatic pardon, on one condition. Vance is stripped of his citizenship. He is declared an exile. He can never set foot on a hegemony world again. If he does, he will be shot on sight without a trial." "A small price for a man's life," Elowen said. "I accept those terms." The magnetic locks on my wrists and ankles suddenly deactivated with a sharp electronic clack. The sudden loss of tension made my blood rush, and I had to grab the arms of the chair to keep from falling over. My joints were stiff, my muscles aching from the days of interrogation and the hours of sitting pinned under those damn lights. I stood up slowly, the silence in the chamber so thick you could have cut it with a vibroblade. Every eye was on me. Hatred, curiosity, fear, and a tiny bit of admiration from the younger techs at the back. I felt like a man walking between two worlds belonging to neither. I started toward the center of the hall, toward the shimmering indigo light of the transmitter. I passed Admiral Valerius, who didn't even have the courage to look at me. He was busy staring at his boots, probably already drafting the report that would explain how he let a traitor walk out the front door. "Vance," he called out just as I reached the projection. I stopped, but I didn't turn around. "Yeah? You think you've won something today? But you're wrong. You've abandoned your own kind for a bunch of gearheads who don't even have a word for loyalty. When they're done with you, you'll be just as much a prisoner there as you were here." I finally turned and looked at him. "Loyalty isn't about the flag you wear, Admiral. It's about the truth you're willing to die for. You lost that a long time ago." I stepped into the light. The sensation of Xylari transport technology wasn't like the jarring, stomach-churning jump of a human teleporter. It felt like being pulled apart into 1,000 threads of music and then woven back together in a room that smelled of rain and ancient stone. When my vision cleared, I was standing on the bridge of the harmonic weaver. The bridge was a vast, organic curve. There were no screens, no clunky buttons, no flickering monitors. Instead, the walls themselves were translucent, showing the black velvet of space and the blue and green marble of the human capital world below. Golden filaments of the weave drifted through the air like dandelion seeds, glowing with a soft, rhythmic light. Elowen was there, standing at the center of a circular platform. She was real this time, not a flickering projection. She looked smaller than she had in the hologram, but the aura of power around her was 10 times more intense. "Welcome to the song, Caelum," she said. I looked around, my boots feeling clumsy and heavy on the polished, pearlescent floor. It's a lot quieter than I expected. "We do not believe in the noise of machines," she said, walking toward me. "We believe in the harmony of intent." She stopped a few paces away. "You look tired, and your ribs." The men in white were not gentle. "I've had worse," I said, though the dull throb in my side told a different story. "I'm just glad to be out of that chair." I was starting to think the Admiral was going to keep me as a souvenir. "He wanted to," she said, her expression softening. "But the truth you broadcast, it has done more damage to his world than my ships ever could. You have broken the spell of their propaganda, Caelum. You have given the people back their eyes." I rubbed my sore wrists. "I just wanted to stop the lying. I didn't realize it would come with a royal escort and a lifetime ban from Earth. Does it bother you, being in exile?" I looked out at the planet below. "For 12 years, I fought for that rock. I bled for it. I killed for it. But the hegemony isn't the planet. It's the parasites living on it. So no, being in exile from them, it feels like I finally took a shower." Elowen smiled, and for a moment, the tension that had been coiled in my chest since the shard began to loosen. But before I could say anything else, a sharp, dissonant chime echoed through the bridge. The golden filaments in the air turned a jagged, angry red. One of the Xylari standing at a nearby console, if you could call a pool of liquid silver a console, turned toward Elowen. His face was grim, his leaf-like ears pinned back against his head. "My queen," he said in their melodic tongue, which the weave translated directly into my mind. "The human orbital platforms are charging their primary cannons. They have ignored the stand-down order." Elowen's face went cold. "Valerius is a fool. He thinks he can strike a blow while we are in a stationary orbit." "He's not a fool," I said, stepping forward. "He's a cornered animal. If he lets you walk away with me and the evidence, his career is over. He'd rather start a fire and die in it than admit he lost." The red filaments began to pulse faster. Elowen looked at me, her indigo eyes searching mine. "What would you have me do, Caelum? My ships can vaporize those platforms in 3 minutes, but the debris would rain down on the cities below. Hundreds of thousands would die in the fallout." The humanistic theme I had been clinging to suddenly felt like a razor in my hand. This was the test. This was the moment where the line between right and wrong became a blurred mess of blood and fire. If I told her to fire, I was no better than the men who nuked New Geneva. If I told her to stay, we might all die. "Don't fire," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "Give me a shuttle." "A shuttle?" Elowen asked. "To go where?" "Back to the primary defense platform. Valerius is there. He's the one holding the trigger. If I can get on board, I can bypass his override. I know the hegemony's security protocols inside and out. I can shut down the cannons from the inside." "You would be going back into the heart of the enemy," she said. "They will kill you the moment you dock." "Maybe, but if you fire, you prove everything they've said about you is true. You prove you're the monster they want the people to fear." I took a step closer to her, ignoring the protest from my battered ribs. "You talked about the song, Elowen. You talked about harmony. This is where the music gets hard. You have to let me try to save them, even if they don't deserve it." Elowen stared at me for a long time. The silence on the bridge was deafening, broken only by the angry red pulse of the warning sensors. Finally, she nodded. "The Weaver does not only create," she whispered. "Sometimes we must allow the threads to find their own path. Go, Caelum Vance. But know this, If you do not return, the song will be a very dark one. The Xylari shuttle was a nightmare to fly for someone used to clunky thrusters and physical joysticks. It was a teardrop of translucent crystal that responded to the movements of my hands in the air, a biofeedback system that made the ship feel less like a vehicle and more like an extension of my own nervous system. It was slick, fast, and about as subtle as a flare in a dark alley. Rusty, the little maintenance drone I'd salvaged from the Shard, was sitting on a shelf behind me. Elowen's technicians had patched him up, but he still had a dent in his casing, and his optical sensor flickered with a faint, nervous indigo light. "You ready for this, buddy?" I asked, my hands hovering over the shimmering control interface. "We're about to knock on a very angry door." Rusty beeped a series of low, mournful tones. "I'm with you," I interpreted. Or maybe he was just complaining about the lack of gravity. I pushed the shuttle into a steep dive, dropping toward the hegemony's primary defense platform, a massive, jagged ring of steel known as the Aegis. It was a monstrosity of military engineering, bristling with railgun turrets and missile silos. At its center was the solar cannon, a weapon capable of punching a hole through a moon. Right now, it was glowing with a terrifying gold light as it drew power from the station's reactors. The comms unit on the shuttle chirped. It was a hegemony frequency. "Unidentified craft. This is Aegis Control. You are entering a restricted combat zone. Identify yourself immediately or be zeroed." "This is Corporal Caelum Vance," I said, leaning into the mic. "I'm coming in for a hard dock in Bay 4. Tell Admiral Valerius I have the encryption keys for the Xylari flagship. If he blows me out of the sky, he loses the only chance he has to win this fight." There was a long silence on the other end. I was gambling everything on Valerius's arrogance. He wouldn't care about peace, but he would care about a tactical advantage. He would think I was coming back to beg for my life, to trade Xylari secrets for a chance to go back to a cell instead of a grave. "Clearance granted," the voice said, though it sounded like it was coming through clenched teeth. "Docking Bay 4 is open. If you deviate from the flight path by 1 meter, we will open fire." I didn't deviate. I brought the teardrop ship into the bay with a precision I didn't know I possessed. The moment the landing struts touched the metal deck, the shuttle's hull turned opaque. I could see the heat shimmer of the atmospheric field and the shadows of at least 20 heavy infantry soldiers waiting for me. "All right, Rusty, stay hidden. If I'm not back in 10 minutes, use the weave thimble to override the shuttle's core and get back to Elowen." Rusty beeped an insistent, angry protest. "That's an order, gearhead," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. I stood up, took a deep breath, and triggered the airlock. The air in the Aegis was cold and smelled of gun oil and fear. I stepped out onto the ramp with my hands raised. Immediately, 4 soldiers rushed forward, slamming me against the side of the shuttle. They didn't bother with magnetic restraints this time. They used zip ties that bit into my skin like wire. "Where are the keys?" the sergeant barked, shoving a pistol into my ribs. "In my head," I said, staring him down. "And I only talk to the shiny boots. Take me to Valerius." They dragged me through the station, and for the first time, I saw the cost of the lie I had exposed. The soldiers we passed didn't look like proud defenders of the hegemony. They looked confused. They were whispering in corners, looking at their data tablets, seeing the footage of New Geneva and the evidence of the fabrication. The discipline that had held the military together for 3 centuries was fraying at the edges. We reached the command bridge, a cavernous room filled with the hum of the solar cannon's charging cycle. Admiral Valerius was standing at the central viewport, his back to me. He looked smaller than he had in the tribunal, framed by the massive weapon he was about to fire. "You're a persistent little cockroach, Vance," he said without turning around. "I gave you a chance to run into the sunset with your alien queen. Why did you come back? Because I know you're about to kill 1 million people to save your own ego?" I said, and I couldn't live with the static of that on my conscience. Valerius turned, and I saw the madness in his eyes. It wasn't the madness of a screaming lunatic. It was the cold, calculated insanity of a man who believed he was the only thing standing between order and chaos. "I am saving the hegemony," he said. "The Xylari are an infection. They use their music and their threads to bypass our walls, our minds. If I don't fire this cannon, if I don't show the galaxy that we are still the masters of our own space, then we are already dead. The truth you told? It's a distraction, a minor casualty in the long game of survival. He walked toward me, his boots clicking rhythmically on the metal floor. Give me the encryption keys, Vance. Give me a way to pierce their shields, and maybe I'll let you die with a bit of dignity. I don't have any keys, Admiral. I lied. Valerius stopped, his face twitching. Then why are you here? To tell you that it's over. I tapped the side of my neck, where the weave thimble was hidden under a thin layer of synthetic skin. Elowen didn't just give me a ride. She gave me a connection. The Admiral's eyes widened as he realized the trap. Through the thimble, I reached out to the station's reactor. I wasn't a weaver, but I had spent my life as a grunt maintaining these systems. I knew where the valves were, where the fail-safes lived, and where the glitches could be created. I didn't try to shut the cannon down. I tried to talk to it. I sent a pulse of indigo energy through the station's power grid. It was a song of sorts, a jagged, dissonant tune that told the solar cannon its target was no longer in front of it. "What are you doing?" Valerius roared, lunging for me. The command bridge erupts in a cacophony of alarms. The golden light of the cannon suddenly shifted to a volatile, screaming violet. "Warning! Primary containment failure!" The automated voice shrieked. Energy backflow detected in Sector Alpha 1. Valerius grabbed me by the throat, his face inches from mine. "Shut it down! Shut it down now, or I'll tear your heart out." I choked out a laugh, even as the air began to leave my lungs. It's not a machine anymore, Admiral. It's part of the song, and it doesn't want to play your game." The station shuddered. A massive explosion rocked the lower decks, the sound muffled by the thick hull but still powerful enough to throw everyone on the bridge to the floor. The solar cannon didn't fire. It bled. The energy it had been storing for the last hour was venting into space, a harmless firework of violet light that illuminated the nebula for thousands of kilometers. Valerius scrambled to his feet, reaching for his sidearm. "You traitorous!" But he didn't finish the sentence. Behind him, the bridge windows shattered inward as a Xylari boarding pod slammed through the reinforced glass. The atmospheric field held the air in, but the silence that followed was terrifying. Elowen stepped out of the pod. She wasn't carrying a weapon, but the weave threads around her were so bright they hurt to look at. She looked at Valerius with a pity that was more devastating than any bullet. "The era of your silence is over, Admiral," she said. "The soldiers on the bridge, the men who had been ready to die for the hegemony, didn't fire. They looked at the Queen, they looked at the venting cannon, and they looked at me, lying on the floor, bruised and broken. One by one, they lowered their rifles. Miller, the young kid from the tribunal, was the first to drop his weapon. It hit the floor with a heavy clang. "I'm done," he whispered. "I'm done with the lies." Valerius looked around, his world collapsing in a matter of seconds. He was a man who had built his life on a foundation of iron and blood, and now he was standing on air. He raised his pistol, not at Elowen and not at me. He looked at the solar cannon, then at the viewport, and then he simply sat down in his command chair. He didn't say a word. He just stared into the void. Elowen walked over to me and knelt down, her fingers brushing the zip ties on my wrists. They dissolved into golden dust. "You are a very difficult man to keep track of, Caelum Vance," she said softly. I tried to sit up, but my body felt like it had been through a trash compactor. "I did it," I whispered. I stopped the cannon. "You did more than that," she said, helping me to my feet. "You showed them that there is a third path. Neither invasion nor submission. Only the truth." I looked at the soldiers, at the broken station, and at the Admiral who was now a ghost in his own seat. "What happens now?" "Now," Elowen said, her voice echoing through the silent bridge, "we see if the human race is ready to learn a new song." But as I leaned on her, watching the violet light fade into the black of space, I knew the cost had been high. I was a man without a home, a soldier without a war, and a traitor who had saved his enemies. I looked at Elowen, and for the first time I felt the weight of the turning point. We hadn't just stopped a war. We had started something far more complicated. We had started the process of forgiveness. And in a galaxy built on 300 years of hate, that was going to be the hardest fight of all. The silence on the bridge of the Aegis was far more dangerous than the screaming sirens had been. It was the kind of silence that precedes a total system collapse, the heavy airless pause before a predator strikes. Admiral Valerius remained in his command chair, a hollowed-out monument to a dead ideology. He didn't look like a man who had lost a battle. He looked like a man who had realized the floor he had spent 50 years walking on was actually the surface of a frozen lake, and the ice was finally giving way. "You think it's over because you broke the gun," Valerius said, his voice a dry rasp that barely carried over the hum of the dying reactors. "You're a child, Vance. You and your Weaver Queen. You think the hegemony is just a fleet and a few angry old men." "It's a system of lies, Admiral," I replied, wiping a smear of blood from my lip. "And I just pulled the plug." The Admiral's mouth twisted into a ghost of a smile. "The hegemony is a machine designed to survive the death of its parts. Do you really think High Command would leave a defense platform this vital in the hands of a man who might fail?" My internal alarm went off, the one that had kept me alive in 3 different border wars. I looked at the security monitors. The internal sensors were flatlining, not because of the explosion, but because someone was manually zeroing the feeds. "Elowen," I said, turning to her, "we need to go. Right now." The Queen tilted her head, her leaf-like ears twitching. "The song in this place has changed," she whispered. "It is no longer dissonant. It is silent." A muffled thud vibrated through the floor, followed by the high-pitched whine of a pressurized door being bypassed. It wasn't the sound of Xylari boarding parties, their techs sang. This was the sound of cold, hard Terran steel. Miller, the young guard who had dropped his rifle earlier, looked at the entrance with wide, terrified eyes. "Who is that?" "The reinforcement shuttles aren't due for another hour." "They aren't reinforcements," I muttered, diving for a discarded pulse rifle on the deck. "They're the Obsidian Guard." The Obsidian Guard didn't exist in the official manuals. They were the hegemony's erasers, genetic slop soldiers who were more cybernetic than biological, programmed with one primary SOP: leave no witnesses to failure. If the Aegis had failed to fire, and the truth had been leaked, the Obsidian Guard was the hegemony's way of burning the evidence. And everyone on this bridge, including Valerius, including me, and including Elowen, was evidence. The bridge doors didn't explode. They dissolved. A thermite-laced breaching charge turned the heavy alloy into a molten curtain, and through the white-hot spray stepped 4 figures in matte black tactical rigs. Their visors were blank, featureless plates of polarized glass. They didn't shout for surrender. They didn't ask for identification. They raised their flechette rifles and began to sweep the room with systematic, lethal precision. "Miller, get down!" I screamed. I tackled the kid just as a burst of razor-sharp flechettes shredded the air where his head had been a second before. I rolled behind a reinforced console, pulling the pulse rifle into my shoulder. The weapon was heavy, familiar, and felt like a curse in my hands. Elowen was already moving. She didn't have a gun, but the weave threads around her were whipping through the air like golden lariats. She threw a hand outward, and the floor plating in front of the lead Obsidian soldier buckled upward, creating a makeshift shield. "Caelum, we cannot stay here," she called out, her voice calm despite the storm of lead and energy. "They are not here to fight. They are here to sanitize." "I know." I popped up from behind the console and fired a 3-round burst. The blue bolt slammed into the lead guard's chest plate. He didn't even flinch. The kinetic impact would have broken a normal man's ribs, but these guys were hardwired to ignore pain. "Rusty," I barked. The little drone had followed me from the shuttle, hovering near the ceiling. "Find me a back door." The drone beeped a frantic, staccato sequence and zipped toward a maintenance hatch near the back of the bridge. "Admiral," I yelled toward the command chair, "if you want to live long enough to see your court-martial, you better move your brass-covered ass." Valerius didn't move. He watched the Obsidian Guard approach with a strange, detached fascination. "They're my boys," he whispered. "I helped draft the protocol." One of the black-clad soldiers raised his rifle toward the Admiral. There was no hesitation, no salute, just a single, muffled click. Valerius's head snapped back, and the man who had ruled the sector for 2 decades slumped forward, another casualty of the machine he had helped build. The boundary between right and wrong had never been thinner. I hated Valerius. I wanted him to pay for New Geneva. But seeing him executed by his own necessity felt like watching the universe eat itself. "Come on!" I grabbed Miller by the tactical vest and dragged him toward the hatch Rusty had found. Elowen followed, her fingers dancing in the air as she wove a shimmering barrier of indigo energy to deflect the incoming fire. We scrambled into the maintenance crawl space, the metal walls closing in around us. The air in here was stale and hot, vibrating with the distant roar of the station's self-destruct sequence. I knew that sound. The Obsidian Guard wouldn't just kill us, they would scuttle the entire Aegis to make sure the glitch was buried in the vacuum. "We have 4 minutes," I said, checking my wristcom. "Maybe 5 before the reactor goes critical." Miller was hyperventilating, his hands shaking so hard he nearly dropped his sidearm. "They killed him. They just killed the Admiral. He was one of them." "He was a liability, Miller," I said, pushing him forward through the dark tunnel. "That's the problem with the hegemony. The moment you stop being a tool, you become trash." "And what about us?" Miller asked, his voice cracking. "What are we now?" "We're the ones who are going to survive," Elowen said from behind me, "because we have chosen to hear a different song." We reached a junction in the crawl space. To the left was the escape pod bay. To the right was the docking bay, where the Xylari shuttle was parked. "The pods will be tracked," I said. "They'll be picked off before they clear the debris field. We have to get to the shuttle." We dropped out of a ceiling vent into the hallway leading to Docking Bay 4. It was a charnel house. The soldiers who had defected, the ones who had lowered their rifles for me, were scattered across the deck. The Obsidian Guard had been thorough. I felt a surge of cold, sharp fury. These men hadn't been war criminals. They were just kids like Miller who had finally decided to do the right thing, and they had been slaughtered for it. "Wait," Miller whispered, pointing to a pile of crates. A single soldier was slumped there, his armor scorched. He was clutching a wound in his side, his breathing ragged and wet. It was the sergeant who had shoved a pistol into my ribs earlier. "Leave me," the sergeant gasped as we approached. "Just get the Queen out." Miller hesitated. "We can't leave him, Caelum." "If we stop, we all die," I said, the old soldier in me screaming that the mission came first. The logic of the hegemony was trying to claw its way back into my brain. 1 life versus 4. The math was simple, but then I looked at Elowen. She wasn't looking at the exit. She was looking at the sergeant, her hand reaching out toward him. "The value of a life is not a calculation, Caelum," she said softly. "It is the core of the melody. If we abandon him to save ourselves, we have already lost the war we are fighting." I stared at her, and then at the sergeant. I remembered the 5,000 at New Geneva. I remembered the choice I had made to release Elowen. The humanistic theme wasn't just a pretty idea you talked about over bad coffee. It was a weight you had to carry when your legs were screaming to run. "Fine," I growled. "Miller, take his other arm." We hauled the sergeant up, his weight a grueling burden as we stumbled toward the bay. Behind us, the footsteps of the Obsidian Guard echoed in the corridor, heavy, rhythmic, and unstoppable. We reached the bay doors just as the station shuddered with a massive internal explosion. The lights flickered and died, replaced by the spinning red glare of the emergency strobes. The shuttle was there, a shimmering beacon of crystal in the dark hangar. But standing between us and the ship were 2 more Obsidian Guards. They didn't speak. They didn't move. They just raised their rifles. I stepped in front of Elowen and the wounded sergeant. I had 1 charge left in my pulse rifle and a body that felt like it was made of glass. "Rusty," I whispered. "Do it." The little drone, which had been lurking in the shadows of the ceiling, dove like a kamikaze pilot. He didn't have weapons, but he had the weave thimble I had given him. He slammed into the overhead power conduit, discharging every bit of energy in his core. The hangar erupted in a cascade of blue sparks. The Obsidian Guard's cybernetic visors short-circuited, blinding them for a crucial 3 seconds. "Go!" I yelled. We scrambled up the ramp of the Xylari shuttle. I dumped the sergeant onto a bench and dove into the pilot's seat. My fingers flew across the shimmering interface, the biofeedback system screaming as it sensed the station's imminent destruction. I didn't wait for the docking clamps to release. I didn't wait for the hangar doors to open. I pushed the thrusters to 100%. The crystal ship lanced forward, its nose cone shearing through the heavy hangar doors like they were made of parchment. We tumbled out into the vacuum just as the Aegis vanished in a silent, blinding sphere of white light. The shockwave hit us, sending the shuttle into a violent spin. I fought the controls, the weave threads burning against my skin as I tried to stabilize our flight path. Slowly the spinning slowed, and the black velvet of space returned to the viewport. The Aegis was gone. 1,000,000 tons of hegemony pride turned into a cloud of drifting iron. I leaned back in the seat, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I looked back at the cabin. Miller was tending to the sergeant's wound. Elowen was standing by the window, watching the remnants of the station sparkle like dying stars. She turned to me, her indigo eyes filled with a profound, weary sadness. "You chose to save him," she said. "I didn't have a choice," I replied. She smiled faintly. "That is the greatest lie humans tell themselves. You always have a choice, Caelum Vance. That is what makes your music so beautiful." I looked at my hands. They were covered in grease, blood, and the golden dust of the weave. I wasn't a soldier of the hegemony anymore. I wasn't in exile. I was something else, something new. And as we banked toward the Xylari flagship, I realized the harvest of shadows was over. Now we had to see what would grow in the light. If the Aegis was a monument to iron and fire, the harmonic weaver was a temple of light and thought. As our battered shuttle slipped into the docking bay of the Xylari flagship, I felt a sensation I hadn't experienced in 15 years. Peace, not the hollow silence of a foxhole between barrages, but a deep, resonant stillness that seemed to vibrate in my very marrow. The docking bay was an open terrace of pearlescent stone, shielded from the vacuum by a shimmering curtain of indigo energy. There were no greasy mechanics or clanking loaders here. Instead, groups of Xylari moved with the synchronized grace of a school of fish, their thoughts weaving together to guide the movement of supplies and smaller craft. We stepped off the ramp, and a dozen Xylari healers rushed forward. They didn't use medkits or scalpels. They placed their hands near the sergeant's wounds, and golden threads began to knit the flesh back together before my eyes. Miller stood there, his jaw practically hitting the floor. Are they magic?" "It's not magic, Miller," I said, though I was just as mesmerized. "It's biology. They just figured out how to talk to the cells instead of cutting them." Elowen stepped forward, her regal presence returning as her people bowed their heads in a silent, melodic greeting. She looked at me, her expression unreadable. "You must come with me, Caelum. The High Council is waiting." "The High Council?" I rubbed the back of my neck. "I'm pretty sure I'm not dressed for a royal audience. I look like I've been dragged through a gravel pit." "They do not care for your appearance," she said. "They care for the resonance of your soul." She led me through the heart of the ship. It was like walking through a living forest made of glass and song. The walls pulsed with a soft, rhythmic light that changed color as we passed, reacting to our moods. When I felt a twinge of anxiety, the walls turned a soothing forest green. When I thought of the obsidian guard, they flickered a sharp, warning amber. We reached a circular chamber at the very top of the ship. The floor was transparent, offering a dizzying view of the stars and the retreating hegemony fleet far below. Standing in a semicircle were 7 Xylari elders, their skin pale as bone and their eyes filled with the wisdom of centuries. "This is the man?" one of them asked, his voice sounding like wind through dry leaves. "The soldier who broke the machine?" "This is Caelum Vance," Elowen replied, her voice ringing with a pride that made my chest tighten. "He is the reason the song continues." The elders studied me. I felt like a bug under a microscope, or an ancient artifact being appraised for its flaws. "He is a creature of the hegemony," another elder said, her eyes flashing with a cold indigo. "His hands are stained with the blood of our kin. Why should we allow a predator into the heart of the weave?" I took a step forward, ignoring the warning twitch in my leaf-like ears. Wait, I didn't have those. I was just starting to feel like I did. "I'm not here to ask for a seat at your table," I said, my voice steady. "I'm here because the hegemony isn't going to stop. They scuttled the Aegis to hide the truth. They'll do the same to the next station and the next colony until there's nothing left but a perfectly silent empire. I looked at the elder who had called me a predator. You talk about harmony, but you're hiding in the dark, waiting for the humans to kill themselves off. That's not a song. That's a funeral dirge. The room went deathly silent. Elowen looked at me with a mixture of shock and admiration. The elders whispered among themselves, their voices blending into a dissonant hum. The soldier speaks with the bluntness of his kind, the first elder said, but there is truth in his resonance. The hegemony is a cancer that will consume the sector if left unchecked. What do you propose? Elowen asked. We propose a final severance, the elder replied. We will fold space and return to the hidden reaches. We will leave the humans to their own devices. They are a failed species, Elowen. To stay is to risk the corruption of the weave. No, I said, stepping into the center of the circle. You can't leave. And why not, human? The cold-eyed elder snapped. Because the truth is out there now, I said. Because of the broadcast. There are thousands of people on those colonies who are waking up. They're realizing they've been lied to for 300 years. If you leave now, you leave them to be slaughtered by the Obsidian Guard. You leave them to the darkness. I turned to Elowen. You told me the universe corrects its own imbalances. Well, this is the imbalance. You have the power to help them, not with ships and cannons, but with the weave. Show them what peace looks like. Show them that they don't have to be tools. Elowen looked at the elders and then back at me. Her face was a mask of internal conflict. She was a queen, sworn to protect her people, but she was also a weaver, sworn to the song of all living things. If we stay, we face a full-scale war, an elder warned. The hegemony will send everything they have to destroy us. Then we fight a different kind of war, Elowen said, her voice growing stronger. We do not fire on their ships. We sing to their hearts. We broadcast the weave. We show them the memory of New Geneva as it truly was, and the hope of what could be. The elders looked at each other, the indigo light in the room swirling in a frantic, undecided pattern. This is the human's influence, the cold-eyed elder hissed. He has brought his chaos into our harmony. It's not chaos, I said. It's choice, and it's the only thing that's going to save any of us. The debate lasted for hours or maybe minutes. Time didn't work the same way on the harmonic weaver. I sat on the floor, my back against the translucent wall, watching the stars. Miller came in at one point, looking overwhelmed. They're letting the sergeant stay, he whispered. He's going to be okay. But Caelum, what are we going to do? We can't go back. We're not going back, Miller, I said. We're going forward, even if we have to pave the way ourselves. Finally, Elowen walked over to me. The council has reached a decision, she said. And we stay, she whispered, but the cost will be high. The hegemony has activated the dead man's switch. I stood up, a cold knot forming in my stomach. What switch? The Aegis wasn't the only thing rigged to explode, Elowen said, her eyes filled with tears. Every major colony in the sector has a hidden thermite core in its primary reactor. If the High Command loses control of the narrative, they intend to purify the sector. They will burn it all down rather than let us have it. The pure, unadulterated evil of the plan took my breath away. It was the ultimate expression of the hegemony's logic. If the system fails, the components must be destroyed. How long? I asked. 48 hours, she said. I looked out at the vastness of space. 48 hours to save 10 billion people from their own government. All right, I said, reaching for the pulse rifle I had brought from the Aegis. Tell your council to start their song. I need a fast ship and a name for every reactor technician in the sector. Elowen touched my arm. You cannot do this alone, Caelum. I'm not alone, I said, looking at Miller, and then at the little repaired drone, Rusty, who was hovering nearby. I've got the best gearheads in the galaxy. The humanistic theme had moved from the heart to the hands. It wasn't enough to believe in the truth. We had to fight for the right of others to live it. The boundary between right and wrong was no longer a line in the sand. It was a bridge we had to build while the world was on fire. And as the harmonic weaver began to pulse with a blinding golden light, I knew the real climax was just beginning. The 48 hours we had to save 10 billion lives didn't feel like time anymore. It felt like a tightening noose. We were back on the shuttle, but the interior was no longer just crystalline light. It had been modified by Xylari technicians into a mobile command node, humming with the frantic energy of a billion gold filaments. Elowen stood at the center, her fingers weaving through the air, as if she were playing a harp made of lightning. "We have reached the first 6 colonies," she said, her voice strained. "The harmonic dampener is holding the reactors in a state of stasis, but the hegemony's override commands are becoming more aggressive. They are trying to force a thermal runaway from the inside out." I was hunched over a tactile map of the prime sector. Next to me, Miller was working with Rusty, the little drone whose chassis was now reinforced with Xylari nanites. Miller's face was smudged with grease and sweat, his hegemony uniform torn and discarded in favor of a light Xylari flight suit. "Caelum, we've got a problem at the Ethelgard hub," Miller said, his voice tight with the kind of focus you only see in soldiers who have accepted they might not see tomorrow. "The Obsidian Guard have locked down the manual override. Even if the Queen sends the harmonic signal, the physical fail-safes have been welded shut. Someone has to go in there and pull the pins." I looked at the hub. Ethelgard was the heart of the civilian sector. If that reactor blew, it would take 3 nearby moons with it. "Then that's where we're going," I said. I grabbed my pulse rifle, checking the power cell. It was at 95%. Not perfect, but enough to make a statement. "Caelum, wait," Elowen said, stepping away from the weave. "If you go to Ethelgard, you are stepping into a kill zone. The Obsidian Guard there have been told that you are the one who triggered the self-destruct. They think you are the monster." I let out a dry, sharp laugh. "That's the beauty of the hegemony, isn't it? They always make sure the guy trying to put out the fire is holding the match in the eyes of the public." I walked over to her, the golden light of the ship reflecting in my tired eyes. "I spent 12 years being the guy who didn't ask questions. I was a good soldier. I followed the SOP until my soul was just static. But those people on Ethelgard, they don't deserve to be a statistic in some admiral's final report." Elowen touched my hand. The warmth of her skin was the only thing that felt real in a world made of shifting data and impending doom. "The song you are singing today is a difficult one, Caelum. It requires you to face your brothers and treat them as enemies, even though you know they are just as blinded as you were." "They aren't enemies," I said, pulling the rifle strap over my shoulder. "They're just waiting for someone to show them the exit." We dropped into the Ethelgard atmosphere at a velocity that turned the shuttle into a screaming streak of fire. The Obsidian Guard had their anti-air batteries primed, but the Xylari tech was like a ghost in their machines. We slipped through their targeting grids like a whisper through a crowded room. The hub was a massive, brutalist spire of black iron, jutting out of the landscape like a jagged tooth. We landed on the cooling platform, the heat from the reactor core already making the air shimmer and dance. "Miller, stay with the ship." "Keep the engines hot," I barked. "No way," Miller said, sliding a sidearm into his holster. "You're not the only one who's tired of being a tool, Caelum. I'm seeing this through." I looked at him for a second, seeing the boy from the tribunal who had been shaking with fear. He wasn't shaking anymore. He had found a reason to stand still. "All right, kid, check 6 and stay behind the drone." We breached the reactor level 30 minutes before the deadline. The corridor was a nightmare of red emergency lights and the rhythmic, pounding thud of the coolant pumps struggling to stay ahead of the heat. And there, standing in the center of the walkway, were the Obsidian Guard. There were 6 of them. Their black armor looked like a void in the middle of the glowing red hallway. They didn't move. They just raised their rifles, the red laser sights painting dots on my chest like a group of angry insects. "Corporal Vance," the lead guard said through his external vocoder. It was a flat mechanical sound. "You are a traitor to the human race. You will be liquidated." I didn't raise my rifle. I kept it pointed at the floor. "You guys know what's in those reactors, don't you?" I asked, my voice echoing in the metallic space. "You know that if you pull that trigger, you're not just killing me. You're killing your families back on the inner rim. You're killing the truth." "The truth is what the High Command dictates," the guard replied. "The High Command is a corpse in a command chair," I shouted. "Admiral Valerius is dead. He was executed by the very protocol you're following right now." The red dots didn't move. The Obsidian Guard didn't have souls. They had directives. but I could see the other soldiers behind them, the regular grunts, the technicians who were frantically trying to stabilize the core. They were listening. I stepped forward, one foot in front of the other, directly into the line of fire. "Caelum, what are you doing?" Miller hissed from behind a crate. "I'm giving them a choice," I whispered back. I stopped 5 meters from the lead obsidian guard. I reached up and pulled the weave thimble from my neck, holding it out in my open palm. It was glowing with a brilliant, pulsing indigo light, the same light that was currently holding 5 other colonies together. "This isn't an alien weapon," I said to the soldiers in the back. "This is a bridge. It's the connection that the hegemony is so afraid of. It's the sound of a world that doesn't need to lie to stay alive." I looked the lead guard in the visor. "If you're going to kill me, do it now. But if you want to be something more than a weapon, step aside and let me pull the pins." The silence that followed was the longest 10 seconds of my life. I could feel the heat of the reactor through the soles of my boots. I could hear Miller's jagged breathing. I could hear the countdown in my own head. 20 minutes. The lead guard's finger tightened on the trigger. "Drop the guns!" a voice roared from the shadows. It was the sergeant we had saved from the Aegis. He was pale, his side heavily bandaged, but he was standing tall, his rifle aimed at the back of the obsidian guard's head. He wasn't alone. A dozen regular soldiers had stepped out of the maintenance bays, their weapons trained on the black-clad elite. "Vance is telling the truth," the sergeant said, his voice raw but certain. "I saw the Admiral die. I saw the ships. The hegemony is burning the house down to hide the smoke. We aren't let them do it." The obsidian guards started to turn, their programming struggling to compute a multi-front conflict with their own allies. In that moment of hesitation, I didn't fire my rifle. I lunged forward and slammed the weave thimble into the reactor's primary interface. The indigo light flooded the room, surging into the black iron spire. The screaming alarm suddenly dropped in pitch, turning from a frantic shriek into a low, melodic hum. The gold filaments of the weave began to crawl over the walls, sealing the cracks in the containment fields and overriding the thermal runaway. The countdown stopped at 14 minutes and 22 seconds. The lead obsidian guard lowered his rifle, the red laser sight fading into nothing. He looked at his hands, then at the sergeant, and then at me. For the first time, I saw a flicker of movement behind that polarized visor, a human eye blinking in the light of a new world. "It's over," I said, leaning against the warm metal of the reactor casing. "The machine is broken." The conflict didn't end with a grand battle or a final explosion. It ended with a room full of tired men realizing they didn't have to hate each other anymore. Miller stepped out from behind the crates, his face wet with tears. The sergeant lowered his gun and slumped against the wall, his strength finally giving out. I looked at the weave thimble, now dull and gray, its energy spent. I had spent my life thinking that the only way to win a war was to be the last one standing. But as I watched the soldiers start to talk to each other, not as ranks and numbers, but as people, I realized that the real victory was in the connection. We had saved Ethelgard, we had saved the sector, but the processing had only just begun. I felt a strange, hollow weight in my chest. Not the weight of guilt, but the weight of a life that was finally truly my own. The transition of a galaxy doesn't happen with a fanfare. It happens in the quiet moments between the headlines. 3 months had passed since the night the Dead Man's Switch was deactivated, and the hegemony as we knew it was a dissolving memory. The High Command had been dismantled, replaced by a provisional council of colony leaders and Xylari diplomats. The war was over, but the work of making peace was proving to be much harder than the work of making fire. I was sitting on the terrace of a small outpost on the edge of the Thanatos Nebula. It wasn't a military station. It was a sanctuary, a place where the survivors of the New Geneva lie and the defecting soldiers of the hegemony could find their footing again. The air here didn't smell like ozone and recycled breath. It smelled of damp earth and blooming night lilies, a gift from the Xylari botanists. Rusty was hovering nearby, his chassis now painted a bright, defiant silver. He was busy trying to organize a group of smaller maintenance drones into a formation that looked suspiciously like a dance. "He still doesn't have a name in the database," a voice said from behind me. I didn't need to turn around to know it was Elowen. Her presence felt like a warm breeze against the back of my neck. I looked at the little drone. He doesn't need a name in a database. He knows who he is. That's more than most of us can say. Elowen walked to the edge of the terrace, her regal robes caught in the soft violet light of the nebula. She looked at me, her indigo eyes softer than I had ever seen them. The council is asking for you again, Caelum. They want you to lead the new security detail for the inner rim. I took a sip of my coffee. It was real coffee this time, grown on the Xylari homeworld and roasted to perfection. It tasted like sunlight and wood smoke. Tell them I'm retired, I said with a faint smile. I'm tired of carrying a gun, Elowen. I think I'd rather spend some time learning how to grow things. You have already grown something remarkable, she replied. You grew a conscience in a place that was designed to kill it. I stood up and joined her at the railing. I looked out at the ships drifting in the distance, human freighters and Xylari weavers, moving in the same currents, no longer separated by force fields and fear. Miller was out there somewhere, training the new generation of pilots. The sergeant was running a veterans clinic on Ethelgard. The world was moving on. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small piece of the original containment field from the shard. It was a jagged shard of blue glass, harmless now, its energy long gone. I looked at it for a long time, thinking about the man I had been when I first sat in that security chair. I was so sure of everything back then. I knew who the enemy was. I knew what my orders were. I knew that the universe was a cold, logical place where the only thing that mattered was staying alive. I thought that by following the rules I was protecting the world, but all I was doing was protecting a lie. I've realized something, Elowen. She tilted her head. And what is that? I've realized that the most dangerous thing in the galaxy isn't a solar cannon or a Xylari fleet. It's the silence. It's the moment we decide to stop asking why. It's the moment we decide that some people's lives are worth less than the systems we build to control them. We spend so much time building walls to keep the monsters out that we don't notice when we become the monsters ourselves. I tossed the shard of blue glass over the railing. It tumbled into the darkness of the nebula, a tiny spark that was quickly swallowed by the violet light. For 12 years, I was a soldier of the static. I let the noise of the hegemony drown out the sound of my own heart. I thought that being a man meant being a weapon, but I was wrong. Being a man means being a bridge. It means choosing to see the human in the alien, the truth in the lie, and the hope in the wreckage. I looked at Elowen, and for the first time, I didn't see a queen or a prisoner. I saw a soul that had survived the same darkness I had. I used to think that the galaxy was a zero-sum game, I continued, my voice low and steady. I thought that for one person to win, another had to lose. But the weave, it showed me that we're all part of the same song. If one of us is out of tune, the whole thing suffers. And the most heroic thing any of us can do isn't to kill for a cause, but to have the courage to listen. I've spent a lot of time looking back at the trail of blood and iron I left behind. I can't erase it. I can't bring back the 5,000 people at New Geneva. But I can make sure that their silence isn't the final word. I can make sure that the world we build now is one where no one has to choose between their duty and their soul. I reached out and touched Elowen's hand. For the first time, I wasn't afraid of the connection. I wasn't afraid of the static. So, Elowen, I said, looking out at the endless sea of stars. What happens next? She smiled and the light of the nebula seemed to brighten in response to her joy. Next, Caelum Vance. We see what kind of music we can make when we aren't afraid of the silence. I walked back into the outpost, leaving the rifle on the table. I picked up a small gardening tool instead, its handle worn and comfortable in my hand. It was a small change, a simple action, but it felt like the most revolutionary thing I had ever done. As I started to clear the earth for a new row of lilies, I looked up at the sky one last time. I wondered about all the other soldiers out there, all the other people sitting in dark rooms, holding bad coffee and waiting for orders. I wondered if they could hear the song yet. I spent years carrying my anger and my obedience like a suit of armor, only to realize it was actually a prison. I thought I was protecting myself, but I was really just locking myself away from the world. I wonder, is there a wall you've built in your own life to keep the different or the scary at bay? What would happen if you had the courage to turn off the force field and just listen? I knelt down in the soft, dark soil, my fingers finding the cool earth. The silence was gone. In its place was a harmony that I was finally, truly a part of. The first green shoot of a night lily broke through the surface of the ground, reaching for the light of the distant stars.